Chapter 4. An infuriated people. A fresh misfortune has occurred, was the greeting with which Beric's mother met him on his return home. Prasutagus is dead, and this is not the worst. He has left half his estates to the Roman Empire. To the Roman Emperor? Beric reported. Is it possible, mother? It is true, Beric. You know he has always tried to curry favour with the Romans, and has kept the Iceni from joining when other tribes rose against Rome. He has thought of nothing but amassing wealth, and in all Britain there is no man who could compare with him in riches. Doubtless he felt that the Romans only bided their time to seize what he had gathered, and so, in order that Boadicea and his daughters should enjoy in peace a portion of his stores, he has left half to Nero. The man was a fool as well as a traitor. The peasant who throws a child out of the door to the wolves knows that it does but whet their appetite for blood, and so it will be in this case. I hear Prasutagus died a week since, though the news has come but slowly, and already a horde of Roman officials have arrived in Norfolk, and are proceeding to make inventories of the king's possessions, and to bear themselves as insolently as if they were masters of all. Trouble must come, and that soon. Boadicea is of different stuff to her husband. She will not bear the insolence of the Romans. It would have been well for the Iceni had Prasutagus died 20 years ago, and she had ruled our country. The gods have clearly willed, mother, that we should rise as one people against the Romans. It may be that it was for this that they did not defend their shrines from the impious hands of the invaders. Naught else stirred the Britons to lay aside their jealousies and act as one people. Now from end to end of the island all are burning for vengeance. Just at this moment comes the death of the Romans' friend Prasutagus, and the passing of the rule of the Iceni into the hands of Boadicea. With the Romans in her capital, the occasion will assuredly not long be wanting, and then there will be such a rising as the Romans have never yet seen, and then, their purpose effected, the gods may well fight on our side. I would that there had been 5 more years in which to prepare for the struggle, but if it must come, it must. The Caius Decianus is just the man to bring it on. Haughty, arrogant, and greedy, he knows nothing of us, and has never faced the Britons in arms. Had Suetonius been here, he would not have acted thus with regard to the affairs of Prasutagus. Had Caius Muro not been absent, his voice might have been raised in warning to the tyrant. But everything seems to conspire together, mother, to bring on the crisis. The sooner the better, Parta exclaimed vehemently. It is true that in time you might teach the whole Iceni to fight in Roman methods, but what is good for the Romans may not be good for us. Moreover, every year that passes strengthens their hold on the land. Their forts spring up everywhere. Their cities grow apace. Every month numbers flock over here. Another 5 years, my son, and their hold might be too strong to shake off. That is so, mother. Thinking of ourselves, I thought not of them. It may be that if it were better to fight now than to wait, well, whenever the signal is given, and from wheresoever it comes, we are ready. Since the news of the capture of Mona had arrived, the tribesmen had drilled with increased alacrity and eagerness. Every man saw that the struggle with Rome must ere long take place, and was eager to take a leading share in the conflict. It was upon them that the blow had fallen most heavily in the former partial rising, and they knew that the other tribes of the Iceni held that their defence of their camp should not have been overcome by the Romans as it was. Hence they had something of a private wrong as well as a national one to avenge. Another fortnight was spent in constant work, until one day the news came that Boadicea's daughters had been most grossly insulted by the Roman officers, and that the queen herself had started for Camalodunum to demand from Decianus a redress of their wrongs and the punishment of the offenders. The excitement was intense. Every man felt the outrage upon the daughters of their queen as a personal injury, and when Beric took his place before the men of the tribe, who were drawn up in military order, a shout arose: "Lead us to Camalodunum! Let us take vengeance!" "Not yet," Beric cried. "The queen is gone there. We must wait the issue. Not until she gives the orders must we move. A rising now would endanger her safety. We must wait, my friends, until all are as ready as we are. When the time comes, you will not find me backward in leading you." 3 days later came news that seemed at first incredible, but which was speedily confirmed. Decianus had received the queen, had scoffed at her complaints, and when, fired with indignation, she had used threats, he had ordered his soldiers to strip her and scourge her, and the sentence had actually been carried into effect. Then the rage of the tribesmen knew no bounds, and it needed the utmost persuasions of Parla herself to induce them to wait until news came from the north. "Fear not," she said, "that your vengeance will be balked. Boadicea will not submit to this double indignity, of that you may be sure. Wait until you hear from her. When measures are determined upon in this matter, the Iceni must act as one man. We are all equally outraged in the persons of our queen and her daughters. All have a right to share in avenging her insults. We might spoil all by moving before the others are ready. When we move, it must be as a mighty torrent to overwhelm the invaders. Not Camalodunum only, but every Roman town must be laid in ruins. It must be a life and death struggle between us and Rome. We must conquer now or be enslaved forever." It was not long before the messengers arrived from Boadicea, bidding the Sarci prepare for war, and summoning Parta and her son to a council of the chiefs of the tribe, to be held under a well-known sacred oak in the heart of the forest near Norwich. Parta's chariot was at once prepared, together with a second which was to carry Boduoc and a female attendant of Parta, and as soon as the horses were harnessed they started. 2 long days' journey brought them to the place of meeting. The scene was a busy one. Already fully 200 of the chiefs had arrived. Parta was received with great marks of respect. The Sarci were the tribe lying nearest to the Romans, and upon them the brunt of the Roman anger would fall, as it had done before. But her appearance in the answer to the summons showed, it was thought, their willingness to join in the general action of the tribe. Beric was looked at curiously. His 4 years' residence among the Romans caused him to be regarded with a certain amount of suspicion, which had been added to by rumours that he had been impressing upon the tribe the greatness and the power of Rome. Of late there had been reports brought by wandering bards that the Sarci was being practised in the same exercises as those of the Roman soldiers, and there were many who thought that Beric, like Cogdinius, a chief of the Regi of Sussex, had joined himself heart and soul to Rome, and was preparing his tribe to fight side by side with the legions. On the other hand, many, knowing that Parta had lost her husband at the hands of the Romans, and hated them with all her heart, held that she would never have divided her power with Beric, or suffered him to take military command of the tribe, had she not been assured of his fidelity to the cause of Britain. Beric was dressed in the full panoply of a chief. He wore a short skirt or kilt reaching to his knees. Above it a loose vest or shirt girt in by a gold belt, while over his shoulders he wore the British mantle, white in colour and worked with gold. Around his neck was the torque, the emblem of chieftainship. On his left arm he carried a small shield of beaten brass, and from a baldric covered with gold plates hung the straight pointless British sword that had been carried by his father in battle. Even those most suspicious of him could not deny that he was a stalwart and well-built youth with a full share of pith and muscle, and that his residence among the Romans had not given him any airs of effeminacy. The only subject of criticism was that his hair was shorter than that of his countrymen, for although he had permitted it to grow since he left Camalodunum, where he had worn it short in Roman fashion, it had not yet attained its full length. Beric felt a stranger among the others. Since his return home there had been no great tribal gathering, for Prasutagus had for some time been ill and had always discouraged such assemblages, both because they were viewed with jealousy by the Romans and because he begrudged the expense of entertaining. Parta, who was personally known to almost all present, introduced Beric to them. "My son is none the less one of the Iceni for his Roman training," she said. "He has learned much, but has forgotten nothing. He is young, but you will find him a worthy companion in arms when the day of battle comes." "I am glad to hear what you say, Parta," Aska, one of the elder chiefs, said. "It would be unfair to impute blame to him for what assuredly was not his fault, but I feared that they might have taught him to despise his countrymen." "It is not so, sir," Beric said firmly. "Happily I fell into good hands. Caius Muro, the commander of the 12th Legion, in whose charge I was, is a just as well as a valiant man, and had me instructed as if I had been his own son, and I trust that I am none the less a true Briton because I accept him and his from the hatred I bear the Romans. He never said a word to me against my countrymen, and indeed often bewailed that we were not treated more wisely and gently, and were not taught to regard the Romans as friends and teachers rather than oppressors." "Well spoken, young chief," the other said. "Ingratitude is, of all sins, the most odious, and you do well to speak up boldly for those who were kind to you. Among all men there are good and evil, and we may well believe even among the Romans there are some who are just and honourable. But I hear that you admire them greatly, and that you have been telling to your tribe tales of their greatness in war and of their virtues." "I have done so," Beric replied. "A race could not conquer the world as the Romans have done unless they had many virtues. But those that I chiefly told of are the virtues that every Briton should lay to heart. I spoke of their patriotism, of the love of country that never failed, of the stern determination that enabled them to pass through the gravest dangers without flinching, and to show a dauntless face to the foe even when dangers were thickest and the country was menaced with destruction. Above all, how in Rome, though there might be parties and divisions, there were none in the face of a common enemy. Then all acted as one man. There was no rivalry save in great deeds. Each was ready to give life and all he possessed in defence of his country. These were lessons which I thought it well that every Briton should learn and take to heart. Rome has conquered us so far because she has been won while we are rent into tribes having no common union, content to sit with our arms folded while our neighbours are crushed, not seeing that our turn will come next. It was so when they first came in the time of our forefathers. It has been so in those latter times. Tribe after tribe has been subdued, while, had we been all united, the Romans would never have obtained a footing on our shore. No wonder the gods have turned away their faces from a people so blind and so divided when all was at stake. Yes, I have learned much from the Romans. I have not learned to love them, but I have learned to admire them and to regret that in many respects my own countrymen did not resemble them." There was a murmur of surprise among the chiefs who had by this time gathered round, while angry exclamations broke from some of the younger men, but Aska waved his hand. "Beric speaks wisely and truly," he said. "Our dissensions have been our ruin, still more perhaps the conduct of those who should have led us, but who have made terms with Rome in order to secure their own possessions. Among these Prasutagus was conspicuous, and we ourselves were as much to blame as he was that we suffered it. If he knows what is passing here, he himself will see how great are the misfortunes that he has brought upon his queen, his daughters, and the tribe. Had we joined our whole forces with those of Caractacus, the Brigantes too might have risen. It took all the strength of the Romans to conquer Caractacus alone. What could they have done had the Brigantes and we from the north and the whole of the southern tribes, then unbroken, closed down upon them? It is but yesterday since Prasutagus was buried. The grass had not yet begun to shoot upon his funeral mound, and yet his estates have been seized by the Romans, while his wife and daughters have been insulted beyond measure. The young chief of the Sarci had profited by his sojourn among the Romans. The Druids have told me that the priest who has visited the Sarci prophesies great things of him, and for that reason decided that, young as he was, he should share his mother's power and take his place as leader of the tribe in battle, and that he foresaw that, should time be given him to ripen his wisdom and establish his authority, he might some day become a British champion as powerful as Cunobeline, as valiant as Caractacus. These were the words of one of the wisest of the Druids. They have been passed round among the Druids, and even now throughout Britain there are many who never so much as heard of the name of the Sarci, who yet believe that in this young chief of that tribe will some day be found a mighty champion of his country. Prasutagus knew this also, for as soon as Beric returned from Camalodunum, he begged the Druids to find out whether good or evil was to be looked for from this youth, who had been brought up among the Romans, and their report to him tallied with that which I myself heard from them. It was for that reason that Boadicea sent for him with his mother. Although so much younger than any here, and belonging to a tribe that is but a small one among the Iceni, I asked these questions of him, knowing that among some of you there were doubts whether his stay with the Romans had not rendered him less a Briton. He answered as I expected from him, boldly and fearlessly, and as you have heard, wisely, and I for one believe in the predictions of the Druids. But here comes the queen." As he spoke, a number of chariots issued from the path through the forest into the circular clearing, in the centre of which stood the majestic oak, and at the same moment from the opposite side appeared a procession of white-robed Druids, singing a loud chant. As the chariots drew up, the queen and her two daughters alighted from them with a number of chiefs of importance from the branches of the tribe near her capital. Beric had never seen her before, and was struck with her aspect. She was a tall and stately woman, large in all proportions, with her yellow hair falling below her waist. She wore no ornaments or insignia of her high rank. Her dress and those of her daughters were careless and disordered, indicative of mourning and grief, but the expression of her face was that of indignation and passion rather than of humiliation. Upon alighting she acknowledged the greetings of the assembled chiefs with a slight gesture, and then remained standing with her eyes fixed upon the advancing Druids. When these reached the sacred tree they encircled it 7 times, still continuing their chanting, and then ranged themselves up under its branches with the chief Druid standing in front. They had already been consulted privately by the queen and had declared for war, but it was necessary that the decision should be pronounced solemnly beneath the shade of the sacred oak. "Why come you here, woman?" the chief priest asked, addressing the queen. "I come as a supplicant to the gods," she said, "as an outraged queen, a dishonoured woman, and a broken-hearted mother, and in each of these capacities I call upon my country's gods for vengeance. Then in passionate words she poured out the story of the indignities that she and her daughters had suffered, and suddenly loosening her garments and suffering it to drop to her waist, she turned and showed the marks of the Roman rods across her back, the sight eliciting a shout of fury from the chiefs around her. "Let all retire to the woods," the Druid said, "and see that no eyes profanes our mysteries. When the gods have answered, we will summon you." The queen, followed by all the chiefs, retired at once to the forest, while the Druids proceeded to carry out the sacred mysteries. Although all knew well what the decision would be, they waited with suppressed excitement the summons to return and hear the decision that was to embark them in a desperate struggle with Rome. Some threw themselves down under the trees. Some walked up and down together, discussing in low tones the prospects of a struggle and the question what tribes would join it. The queen and her daughters sat apart, none venturing to approach them. Parta and three other female chiefs sat a short distance away talking together, while two or three of the younger chiefs, their attitude towards Beric entirely altered by the report of the Druids' predictions concerning him, gathered round him and asked questions concerning the Romans' method of fighting, their arms and power. An hour after they had retired a deep sound of a conch rose in the air. The queen and her daughters at once moved forward, followed by the four female chiefs, behind whom came the rest in a body. Issuing from the forest, they advanced to the sacred oak and stood in an attitude of deep respect while the chief Druid announced the decision of the gods. "The gods have spoken," he said. "Too long have the Iceni stood aloof from their countrymen. Therefore have the gods withdrawn their faces from them. Therefore has punishment and woe fallen upon them. Prasutagus is dead. His queen and his daughters have suffered the direst indignities. A Roman has seized the wealth heaped up by inglorious cowardice. But the moment has come. The gods have suffered their own altars to be desecrated in order that over the whole length and breadth of the land the cry for vengeance should arise simultaneously. The cup is full. Vengeance is at hand upon the oppressors and tyrants. The land reeks with British blood. Not content with grasping our possessions, our lives and the honour of our women are held as naught by them. Our altars are cold, our priests slaughtered. The hour of vengeance is at hand. I see the smoke of burning cities ascending in the air. I hear the groans of countless victims to British vengeance. I see broken legions and flying men. To arms! The gods have spoken. Strike for vengeance. Strike for the gods. Strike for your country and outraged queen. Chiefs of the Iceni, to arms! May the curse of the gods fall upon an enemy who draws back in the day of battle. May the gods give strength to your arms and render you invincible in battle. The gods have spoken." A mighty shout was raised by his hearers. Swords were brandished and spears shaken, and the cry, "To arms! The gods have spoken," was repeated unanimously. As the Druids closed round their chief, who had been seized with strong convulsions as soon as he had uttered the message of the gods, Boadicea turned to the chiefs and raised her arm for silence. "I am a queen again. I reign once more over a race of men. No longer do I feel the smart of my stripes, for each shall ere long be washed out in Roman blood. But before action, counsel, and before counsel, food, for you have, many of you, come from afar. I have ordered a feast to be prepared in the forest." She led the way across the opposite side of the glade, where a few hundred yards in the forest a number of the queen's slaves had prepared a feast of roasted sheep, pig, and ox, with bread and jars of drink formed of fermented honey, and a sort of beer. As soon as the meal was concluded, the queen called the chiefs round her, and the assembly was joined by the Druids. "War is declared," she said. "The question is, shall we commence at once or shall we wait? There was a general response, "At once," but the chief Druid stepped forward and said, "My sons, we must not risk the ruin of all by undue haste. This must be a national movement if it is to succeed. For a fortnight we must keep quiet, preparing everything for war, so that we may take the field with every man capable of bearing arms in the tribe. In the meantime we, with the aid of the bards, will spread the news of the outrages that the Romans have committed upon the queen and her daughters far and wide over the land. Already the tribes are burning with indignation at the insults to our gods and the slaughter of our priests at Mona, and this news will arouse them to madness. For what is done here today may be done elsewhere tomorrow, and all men will see that only in the total destruction of the Romans is there a hope of freedom. All will be bidden to prepare for war, and, when the news comes that the Iceni have taken up arms, to assemble and march to join us. On this day fortnight, then, let every chief with his following meet at Cardun, which is but a short march from Camalodunum. Then we will rush upon the Roman city, the scene of the outrage, to your queen, and its smoke shall tell Britain that she is avenged, and Rome that her day of oppression is over." The decision was received with satisfaction. A fortnight was none too long for making preparations, assembling the tribesmen, and marching to the appointed spot. "One thing I claim," Boadicea said, "and that is the right to fall upon and destroy instantly the Romans who installed themselves in my capital, who are the authors of the outrages upon my daughters. So long as they live and lord it there, I cannot return." "That is right and just," the Druid said. "Slay all but 10, and hand them over bound to us to be sacrificed on the altars of the gods they have insulted." "I will undertake that task, as my tribe lies nearest the capital," one of the chiefs said. "I will assemble them tonight and fall upon the Romans at daybreak." "See that none escape," the Druid said. "Kill them and all their slaves and followers. Let not one live to carry the news to Camalodunum. I shall be at the meeting place and march at your head," the queen said to the chiefs. "The victory will be ours, I do not doubt, but if the gods will it otherwise, I swear that I shall not survive defeat. Ye gods, hear my vow." The council was now over, and the queen mingled with the chiefs, saying a few words to each. Beric was presented to her by his mother, and Boadicea was particularly gracious to him. "I have heard great things predicted of you, Beric. The gods have marked you out for favour, and their priests tell me that you will be one day a great champion of the Britons. So may it be. I shall watch you on the day of battle, and am assured that none among the Iceni will bear themselves more worthily." An hour later the meeting broke up, and Parta and Beric returned to Cardun, where they at once began to make preparations for the approaching conflict. Every man in the tribe was summoned to attend, and the exercises went on from daybreak till dusk, while the women cooked and waited upon the men. Councils were held nightly in the hall, and to each of the chiefs was assigned a special duty, the whole tribe being treated as a legion, and every chief and fighting man having his place and duty assigned to him. In Camalodunum, although nothing was known of the preparations that were being made, a feeling of great uneasiness prevailed. The treatment of Boadicea had excited grave disapproval upon the part of the great majority of the inhabitants, although new arrivals from Gaul or Rome, and the officials in the suit of Decianus, lauded his actions as an act of excellent policy. "These British slaves must be taught to feel the weight of our arm," they said, "and a lesson such as this will be most useful. Is it for dogs like these to complain because they are whipped? They must be taught to know that they live but at our pleasure, that this island and all it contains is ours. They have no rights save those we choose to give them." But the older settlers viewed the matter very differently. They knew well enough that it was only after hard fighting that Vespasian had subdued the south and Ostorius crushed Caractacus. They knew too that the Iceni gave but a nominal submission to Rome, and that the Trinobantes, crushed as they were, had been driven to the verge of madness by extortion. Moreover, the legions were far away. Camalodunum was well nigh undefended, and lay almost at the mercy of the Britons should they attack. They therefore denounced the treatment of Boadicea as not only brutal but as impolitic in the extreme. The sudden cessation of news from the officials who had gone to take possession of the estate of Prasutagus caused considerable uneasiness among this section of the inhabitants of Camalodunum. Messengers were sent off every day to inquire as to what had taken place after the return of Boadicea, but none came back. The feeling of uneasiness was heightened by the attitude of the natives. Reports came in from all parts of the district that they had changed their attitude, that they no longer crouched at the sight of a Roman but bore themselves defiantly, that there were meetings at night in a forest, and that the women sang chants and performed dances which had evidently some hidden meaning. Decianus, conscious perhaps that his actions were strongly disapproved by all the principal inhabitants of the town, and that perhaps Suetonius would also view it in the same light when it was reported to him, had left the city a few days after the occurrence and had gone to Perulium. His absence permitted the general feeling of apprehension and discontentment more open expression than it would otherwise have had. Brave as the Romans were, they were deeply superstitious, and a thrill of horror and apprehension ran through the city when it was reported one morning that the statue of Victory in the temple had fallen to the ground and had turned round as if it fled towards the sea. This presage of evil created a profound impression. "What do you think of it, Cneius?" Berenice asked. "It is terrible, is it not? Nothing else is spoken of among all the ladies I have seen today, and all agree it forebodes some terrible evil." "It may or it may not," the old scribe said cautiously. "If the statue has fallen by the action of the gods, the omen is surely a most evil one." "But how else could it have fallen, Cneius?" "Well, my dear, there are many Britons in the town, and you know they are in a very excited state. Their women, indeed, seem to have gone well nigh mad with their midnight singing and wailing. It is possible, mind, I do not for a minute say that it is so, for were the suggestions to occur to the citizens it would lead to fresh oppressions and cruelties against the Britons. But it is just possible that some of them may have entered the temple at night and overthrown Victory's image as an act of defiance. You know how the women nightly shriek out their prophecies of the destruction of this town. But could they destroy it, Cneius? Surely they would never dare to attack a great Roman city like this." "I don't know whether they dare or not, Berenice, but assuredly Decianus is doing all in his power to excite them to such a pitch of despair that they might dare do anything, and if they dare I see nothing whatever to prevent them from taking the city. The works erected after Claudius first founded the colony are so vast that they will require an army to defend them, while there are but a few hundred soldiers here. What could they do against a horde of barbarians? I would that your father were back, and also the 2 legions who marched away to join Suetonius. Before they went they ought to have erected a central fort here, to which all could retire in case of danger, and hold out until Suetonius came back to our assistance. But you see, when they went away none could have foreseen what has since taken place. No one could have dreamt that Decianus would have wantonly stirred up the Iceni to revolt. But you don't think they have revolted?" "I know nothing of it, Berenice, but I can put 2 and 2 together. We have heard nothing for a week from the officials who went to seize the possessions of Prasutagus. How is it that none of our messengers have returned? It seems to be almost certain that these men have paid for their conduct to the daughters of Brosier with their lives. But Beric is with the Iceni. Surely we should hear from him if danger threatened." "He is with them," Cneius said, "but he is a chief, and if the tribe are in arms he is in arms also, and cannot, without risking the forfeit of his life for treachery, send hither a message that would put us on our guard. I believe in the lad. 4 years I taught him, and I think I know his nature. He is honest and true. He is one of the Iceni and must go with his countrymen. But I am sure he is grateful for the kindness he received here, and has a real affection for you. Therefore I believe that should my worst fears be verified, and the Iceni attack Camalodunum, he will do his utmost to save you. But they will not kill women and girls, surely, even if they did take the city. I fear that they will show slight mercy to any. Berenice, why should they? We have shown no mercy to them. We have slaughtered their priests and priestesses, and at the storm of their towns have put all to death without distinction of age or sex. If we, a civilized people, thus make war, what can you expect from the men upon whom we have inflicted such countless injuries?" The fall of the Statue of Victory was succeeded by other occurrences in which the awestruck inhabitants read augury of evil. It was reported that strange noises had been heard in the council houses and theatre, while men out in boats brought back the tale that there was the appearance of a sunken town below the water. It was currently believed that the sea had assumed the colour of blood, and that there were, when the tide went out, marks upon the sand as if dead bodies had been lying there. Even the boldest veterans were dismayed at this accumulation of hostile auguries. A council of the principal citizens was held, and an urgent message was despatched to Decianus, praying that he would take instant measures for the protection of the city. In reply to this he despatched 200 soldiers from Verulamium, and these, with the small body of troops already in the city, took possession of the temple of Claudius, and began to make preparations for putting it into a state of defence. Still no message had come from Norwich, but night after night the British women declared that the people of Camalodunum would suffer the same fate they had already overwhelmed those who had ventured to insult the daughters of the queen of the Iceni. A strange terror had now seized the inhabitants of the town. The apprehension of danger weighed upon all, and the peril seemed all the more terrible inasmuch as it was so vague. Nothing was known for certain. No message had come from the Iceni since the queen quitted the town, and yet it was felt that among the dark woods stretching north a host of foes were gathering and might at any moment pour down upon the city. Orders were issued that at the approach of danger all who could do so were to betake themselves at once to the temple, which was to act as a citadel. Yet no really effective measures were taken. There was indeed a vague talk of sending the women and children and valuables away to the legion commanded by Cerealis, stationed in a fortified camp to the south, but nothing came of it. All waited for something definite, some notification that the Britons had really revolted, and while waiting for this nothing was done. One evening a slave brought in a small roll of vellum to Cneius. It had been given him at the door, he said, by a Briton, who had at once left after placing it in his hands. The scribe opened it and read as follows: "To Cneius Nepo, greeting. Obtain British garb for yourself and Berenice. Let her apparel be that of a boy. Should anything unusual occur by night or day, do you and she disguise yourselves quickly and stir not beyond the house. It will be best for you to wait in the tablinum. Lose no time in carrying out this instruction." There was no signature, nor was any needed. So the storm is about to burst," Cneius said thoughtfully when he had read it. "I thought so. I was sure that if the Britons had a spark of manhood left in them, they would avenge the cruel wrongs of their queen. I am rejoiced to read Beric's words and to see that he has, as I felt sure he had, a grateful heart. He would save us from the fate that he clearly thinks is about to overwhelm this place." "The omens have not lied, then. Not that I believe in them. They are for the most part the offspring of men's fancy, but at any rate they will come true this time. I care little for myself, but I must do as he bids me for the sake of the girl. I doubt, though, that whether Beric can save her. These people have terrible wrongs to avenge, and at their first outburst will spare none. Well, I must do my best, and late as it is, I will go out and purchase these garments. It is not likely that the danger will come tonight, for he would have given us longer notice. Still, he may have had no opportunity, and may not have known until the last moment when the attack was to take place. He says lose no time." Cneius at once went to one of the traders who dealt with the natives who came into town, and procured the garments for himself and Berenice. The trader, who knew him by sight, remarked, "Have you been purchasing more slaves?" "No, but I have need for dresses for 2 persons who have done me some service." "I should have thought," the trader said, "they would have preferred lighter colours. These cloths are sombre, and the natives, although their own cloths are for the most part dark, prefer, when they buy of me, brighter colours." "These will do very well," Cneius said. "Just at present Roman colours and cloths are not likely to be in demand among them." "No, the times are bad," the trader said. "There has been scarce a native in my shop for the last 10 days, and even among the townspeople there has been little buying or selling." Cneius returned to the house, a slave carrying his purchase behind him. On reaching home he took the parcel from him and carried it to his own cubicle, and then ordered a slave to beg Berenice to come down from her apartment, as he desired to speak with her. Chapter 5: The sack of Camalodunum. Upon the morning of the day fixed for the gathering of the Iceni, preparations were begun early at Cardun. Oxen and swine were slaughtered, great fires made, and the women in the village were all employed in making and baking oaten cakes upon the hearth. For some days many of them had been employed in making a great store of fermented honey and water. Men began to flock in from an early hour, and by midday every male of the Sarci capable of bearing arms had come in. Each brought with him a supply of cooked meat and cakes, sufficient to last for 3 or 4 days. In the afternoon the tribes began to pour in, each tribe under its chiefs. There was no attempt at order or regularity. They came trooping in masses, the chiefs sometimes in chariots, sometimes on horseback, riding at their head. Parta welcomed them, and food was served out to the men while the chiefs were entertained in the hall. Beric, looking at the wild figures, rough and uncouth, but powerful and massive in frame, was filled with regret that these men knew nothing of discipline, and that circumstances had forced on the war so suddenly. The contrast between these wild figures and the disciplined veterans of Rome, whom he had so often watched as they performed their exercises, was striking indeed. Far inferior in height and muscular power to the tribesmen, the legionaries bore themselves with a proud consciousness in their fighting power that alone went a long way towards giving them victory. Each man trusted not only in himself but on his fellows, and believed that the legion to which he belonged was invincible. Their regular arms, their broad shields and helmets all added to their appearance, while their massive formation, as they stood shoulder to shoulder, shield touching shield, seemed as if it could defy the utmost efforts of undisciplined valour. However, Beric thought with pride that his own tribe, the 1,600 men he had for 6 weeks been training incessantly, would be a match even for the Roman veterans. their inferiority in the discipline that was carried to such perfection among the Romans would be atoned for by their superior strength and activity. His only fear was that in the excitement of battle they would forget their teaching, and breaking their ranks fight every man for himself. He had, however, spared no pains in impressing upon them that to do this would be to throw away all that had been learned. "I have not taught you to fight in Roman fashion," he said, "merely that you should march in regular order and astonish the other tribesmen, but that you should be cool and collected, should be able patiently to stand the shock of the Roman legions, and to fight, not as scattered units, but as a solid whole. You will do well to bear this in mind, for to those who disobey orders and break the line when engaged with the foe I will show no mercy. My orders will be given to each sergeant of 10 men to run a spear through any man who stirs from his post, whether in advance or in retreat, whether to slay or to plunder. The time may come when the safety of the whole army depends upon your standing like a wall between them and the Romans, and the man who advances from his place to the ranks will, as much as the man who retreats, endanger the safety of all." Over and over again had he impressed this lesson upon them. Sometimes he had divided them in two parts and engaged in mimic fight. The larger half, representing the tribesmen, advanced in their ordinary fashion with loud shouts and cries, while the smaller section maintained their solid formation and with levelled spears 5 deep waited the attack. Even those who were at least impressed with the advantages of the exercise through which they had been going could not but feel how immensely superior was the solid order, and how impossible would it have been for assailants to burst through the hedge of pointed weapons. By sunset well nigh 30,000 men had arrived, each sub-tribe passing through the village and taking up its post on the slopes around it, where they were at once supplied with food by the women. With the fighting men were large numbers of women, for those generally accompanied the Britons on their warlike expeditions. Just at sunset a shout arose from the tribesmen on the north side of the village. Boadicea with her daughters and chief councillors drove into the village. Her mien was proud and lofty. She carried a spear in her hand and a sword in her girdle. She had resumed her royal ornaments, and a fillet of gold surrounded her head. Her garments were belted in with a broad girdle of the same metal, and she wore heavy gold armlets and bracelets. She looked with pride upon the tribesmen who thronged shouting to greet her, and exclaimed as she leaped from her chariot, "The day of vengeance is at hand." The fires blazed high all that night round Cardun. Numbers of bards had accompanied the tribes, as not only had those who lived in the households of the principal chiefs come in, but many had been attracted from the country lying near their borders. At every fire, therefore, songs were sung and tales told of the valour and glory of the heroes of old. Mingled with these were laments over the evil days that had befallen Britain, and exhortations to their heroes to avenge the past and prove themselves worthy of their ancestors. In similar manner the night was passed in Parter's Hall. Here the chief bards were assembled with all the tribal leaders, and vied with each other in their stirring chants. Beric moved about among the guests, seeing that their wants were supplied, while Parta herself looked after those who were gathered on the dais. Beric learned from the old chief Aska, who had first spoken to him on the day of their arrival at the sacred oak, that all Britain was ripe for the rising, and that messengers had been received not only from the Brigantes but from many of the southern and western tribes, with assurances that they would rise as soon as they heard that the Iceni had struck the first blow. The Trinobantes will join us at Camalodunum. All goes well. Suetonius with the legions is still in the far west. We shall make an end of them here before he can return. By that time we shall have been joined by most of the tribes, and shall have a force that will be sufficient to destroy utterly the army he is leading. That done, there will be but the isolated forts to capture and destroy, and then Britain will be free from the invader. You think this will be so, Beric?" "I hope and trust so," Beric replied. "I think that success in our first undertaking is a certainty, and I trust we may defeat Suetonius. With such numbers as we shall put in the field, we ought surely to be able to do so. It is not of the present I think so much as of the future. Rome never submits to defeat, and will send an army here to which that of Suetonius will be but a handful. But if we remain united, and utilize the months that must elapse before the Romans can arrive in preparing for the conflict, we ought to be victorious." "You feel sure that the Romans will try to reconquer Britain?" "Quite sure. In all their history there is not an instance where they have submitted to defeat. This is one of the main reasons of their success. I am certain that, at whatever sacrifices they will equip and send out an army that they will believe powerful enough for the purpose." "But there were many years after their first invasion before they came again." "That is true, but in those first two invasions they did not conquer. In the first they were forced to retire, and therefore came again. In the second they had success enough to be able to claim a victory, and so to retire with honour. Besides, Rome is vastly stronger and more powerful now than she was then. Believe me, Aska, the struggle will be but begun when we have driven the last Roman from the island." "We must talk of this again," Aska said, "as it is upon us that the brunt of this struggle will fall. We shall have the chief voice and influence after it is over, and Boadicea will stand in the place that Cunobeline held, of chief king of the island. Then, as you say, much will depend on the steps we take to prepare to resist the next invasion, and young as you are, your knowledge of Roman ways will render your counsel valuable, and give great weight to your advice." "I do not wish to put myself in any way in the foreground," Beric said. "I am still but a boy, and have no wish to raise my voice in the council of chiefs. But what I have learned of Roman history and Roman laws I would gladly explain to those who, like yourself, speak with the voice of authority, and whose wisdom all recognize." In the morning Boadicea said that reports had been brought to her of the manner in which Beric had been teaching the Sarci to fight in Roman fashion, and that she should be glad to see the result. Accordingly the tribesmen proceeded to the open fields a mile away, where they had been accustomed to drill, and they were followed by the whole of those gathered round the village. The queen and Parta drove out in their chariots. When they reached the spot, the chiefs of the other tribes, at Beric's request, called upon their men to draw off and leave a space sufficient for the exercise. This left the Sarci standing in scattered groups over the open space, at one end of which Boadicea and all the chiefs were gathered. "They are now in the position, Queen," Beric said, "of men unsuspecting danger. I shall now warn them that they are about to be attacked, and that they are to gather instantly to repel the enemy." Taking the couch slung over his shoulder, Beric applied it to his lips and blew 3 short notes. The tribesmen ran together. There was, as it seemed to the lookers on, a scene of wild confusion for a minute, and then they were drawn up in companies, each 100 strong, in regular order. A short blast and a long one, and they moved up together into a mass, 5 deep. A single note and the spear fell, and an array of glistening points shone in front of them. A shout of surprise and approval rose from the tribesmen looking on. To them this perfect order and regularity seemed well nigh miraculous. Beric now advanced to the line. At his order the 2 rear ranks stepped backwards a few feet, struck their spears in the ground, and then discharged their javelins, of which each man carried 6, over the heads of the ranks in front, against the enemy supposed to be advancing to attack them. Then, seizing their spears, they fell into line again, and at another order the whole advanced at a quick pace, with levelled spears to the charge, and keeping on till within a few paces of where the queen was standing, halted suddenly and raised their spears. Again a roar of applause came from the tribesmen. "It is wonderful," the queen said. "I had not thought that men could be taught so to move together, and that is how the Romans fight, Beric." "It is, queen," Beric said. "The exercises are exactly similar to those of the Romans. I learnt them by heart when I was among them, and the orders are exactly the same as those given in the legions, only of course they are performed by trained soldiers more perfectly than we can as yet do them. It is but 2 months since we began, and the Romans have practised them for years. Had I time you would have seen them much more perfect than at present." "You have performed marvels," she said. "I wish that you had more time, and that all the Iceni, and not the Sarci only, could have thus learned to meet the enemy. Do you not think so, chiefs?" "It is wonderful," one of the chiefs said, "but I think that it is not so terrifying to a foe as the rush of our own men. It is better for resistance, but not so good for attack. Still it has great merits, but I think it is more suited for men who fight deliberately like the Romans than our own tribesmen, who are wont to rely for victory each upon his own strength and valour." "What say you, Beric?" the queen asked. "It would be presumptuous for me to give my opinion against that of a great chief," Beric said quietly, "but so far strength and valour have not in themselves succeeded. The men of Caractacus had both, but were unavailing against the solid Roman line. We have never yet won a great victory over the Romans, and yet we have fought against them valiantly. None can say that a Briton is not as brave and as strong as a Roman. In our battles we have always outnumbered them. If we have been beaten, therefore, it has been surely because the Roman method of fighting is superior to our own." There was a murmur of assent from several of the chiefs. "Beric's argument is a strong one," the queen said to the one who had spoken, "and I would that all the Iceni had learned to fight in this fashion. However, we shall have opportunities of seeing which is right before we have finished with the Romans. March your men back again, Beric." Beric sounded his horn, and the line, facing half round, became a column and marched in regular order back to the village. The morning meal was now taken, and at midday the march began. Boadicea, with her daughters, Parta, and other women of rank, went first in their chariots, and the Sarci, who, as lying next to the enemy's country, were allowed the post of honour, followed in column behind her, while the rest of the tribesmen made their way in a miscellaneous crowd through the forest. They halted among the trees at a distance of 4 miles from Camalodunum, and then rested, for the attack was not to take place until daybreak on the next morning. Late that evening 2 or 3 women of the Trinobantes came out, in accordance with a preconcerted arrangement, to tell them that there was no suspicion at Camalodunum of the impending danger, and that although there was great uneasiness among the inhabitants, no measures for defence had been taken, and that even the precaution of sending away the women and children had not been adopted. No fires had been lighted. The men slept in the open air, simply wrapping themselves in their manties and lying down under the trees. Beric had a long talk with Boduoc and 10 of the tribesmen of the latter's company. "You understand," Beric said at last, "that if, as I expect, the surprise will be complete and no regular resistance will be offered, I shall sound my horn and give the signal for the tribe to break ranks and scatter. You 10 men will, however, keep together and at once follow Boduoc and myself as soon as we enter the house to which I shall lead you. You will surround the 2 persons I shall place in your charge, and will conduct them to the spot where the chariot will be waiting. You will defend them if necessary with your lives. Should any disobey my order to let you pass through with them, as soon as they are placed in the chariot you will be free to join in the sack, and if you should be losers by the delay, I myself will make up your shares to that of your comrades. You are sure, Boduoc, that all the other arrangements are perfect?" "Everything is arranged. Boduoc, my brother, who drives the chariot that brought your mother's attendants, quite understands that he is to follow as soon as we move off, and keeping a short way behind us is to stop in front of the last house outside the gate until we come. As soon as he has taken them up he will drive off and give them into the charge of our mother, who has promised you to have everything in readiness for them. The skins for beds, drinking vessels, food, and everything else necessary was taken there 2 days ago. My sisters will see to the comfort of the young lady, and you can rely upon my mother to carry out all the orders you have given her. Our hut lies so deeply in the forest that there is little chance of anyone going near it, especially as the whole of the men of the tribe are away." 2 hours before daylight the Iceni moved forward. They were to attack at a number of different points, and each chief had had his position allotted to him. The Sarci were to move directly against the northern gate, and would form the centre of the attack. Each man, by Beric's order, carried a faggot, so that these could be piled against the wall by the gate, and enable them to effect an entrance without the delay that would be incurred in breaking down the massive gates. They passed quietly through the cultivated fields, and past the houses scattered about outside the walls, whose inhabitants had withdrawn into the city since the alarm spread. They halted at a short distance from the gate, for sentries would be on guard there, and remained for nearly an hour, as many of the other tribesmen had a considerably longer distance to go to reach their appointed stations. A faint light was beginning to steal over the sky when, far away on their right, a horn sounded. It was repeated again and again, each time nearer, and ran along far to the left. Then, raising their war cry, the Sarci dashed forward to the gate. The shouts of the sentinels on the walls had arisen as soon as the first horn sounded, and had scarcely died away when the Sarci reached the gate. Each man as he arrived threw down his faggot, and the pile soon reached the top of the wall. Then Beric led the way up and stood on the Roman work. The sentries, seeing the hopelessness of resistance, had already fled, and the Sarci poured in. A confused clamour of shouts and cries rose from the town, above which sounded the yells of the exulting Iceni. Beric gave the signal to the Sarci to scatter, and the tribesmen at once began to attack the houses. Placing himself at the head of Boduoc's chosen party, Beric ran forward. Already from some of the houses armed men were pouring out, but disregarding these, Beric pressed on until he reached the house of Caius Muro. His reason for haste was that, standing rather on the other side of the town, he was nearer the point assailed by one of the other divisions of the tribe than to the north gate, and he feared that others might arrive there before him. Reaching the door, he beat upon it with the handle of his sword. "Open, Cneius!" he shouted. "It is I, Beric." The door was opened at once, and he ran forward into the atrium, which was filled with frightened slaves, who burst into cries of terror as, followed by his men, he entered. "Where are you, Cneius?" Beric shouted. "I am here," the scribe replied from his cubicle. "I will be with you in a moment. It is but a minute since we were awoke by the uproar." "Be quick," Beric said. "There is not a moment to be lost." "Run up to the women's apartments," he said to a slave. "Tell your mistress to hurry down, for that every minute is precious." Almost immediately Berenice came down the stairs in her disguise as a British boy, and at the same moment Cneius issued from his room. "Come, Berenice," Beric said. "There is not a moment to be lost. The town is in our hands, and if others of the tribe arrive, I might not be able to save you." Hurrying them from the house, he ordered the men to close round them, and then started on his way back. A terrible din was going on all around, yells, shouts, and screams arising from every house. Flames were bursting up at a dozen points. To his great satisfaction, Beric reached the point where the Sarci were at work, breaking into houses, before he encountered any of the other Iceni. The men were too busy to pay any attention to the little group of their own tribesmen passing through these. They were soon at the gate. It already stood open, the bolts having been drawn by those who first entered. 50 yards from the wall stood the chariot. "Now you can leave us," Beric said to his followers. "I will rejoin you soon." Berenice was crying bitterly, horror stricken at the sounds. She had heard, though happily she had seen nothing, being closely shut in by the tall forms of her guards. "Thanks be to the gods that I have saved you, Berenice," Beric said, "and you also, Cneius. Now I must commit you to the care of the driver of the chariot, who is one of my tribesmen. He will take you to a retreat where you will, I trust, be in perfect safety until the troubles are over. His mother has promised to do all in her power for your comfort. You will find one of our huts but a rough abode, but it will at least be a shelter." "Cannot you come with us, Beric?" the girl sobbed. "That I cannot do, Berenice. I am a Briton and a chief, and I must be with my tribe. And now I must away. Farewell, Berenice. May your gods and mine watch over you. Farewell, my kind teacher." He took off the torque, the collar formed of a number of small metal cords interlaced with each other, the emblem of rank and command, and handed it to the driver. "You will show this to any you meet, for it may be that you will find parties of latecomers on the road. This will be a proof that you are journeying on my business and under my orders. Do not stop and let them question you, but driving quickly along, and if they should shout and bid you stop, hold up the torque and shout, 'I travel at speed by my chief's order.' Do you both sit down in the chariot," he said to the others. "Then, as you journey rapidly along, it will be supposed that you are either wounded or messengers of importance. Farewell." Cneius and the girl had already mounted the chariot, and the driver now gave the horses rein and started at full speed. Beric turned and re-entered the town slowly. In those days pity for the vanquished was a sentiment but little comprehended, and he had certainly not learned it among the Romans, who frequently massacred their prisoners wholesale. Woe to the vanquished was all a maximum with them, but Beric shrank from witnessing the scene. Now that the tables were turned upon the oppressors, nationally he hated the Romans, but individually he had no feeling against them, and had he had the power he would at once have arrested the effusion of blood. He wished to drive them from the kingdom, not to massacre them, but he knew well that he had no power whatever in such a matter. Even his own tribesmen would not have stayed their hand at his command. To slay a Roman was to them a far more meritorious action than to slay a wolf, and anyone who urged mercy would have been regarded not only as a weakling but as a traitor. Already the work was well nigh done. Pouring in on all sides into the city, the Iceni had burst into the houses and slain their occupants, whether they resisted or not. A few men here and there sold their lives dearly, but the great majority had been too panic stricken with the sudden danger to attempt the slightest resistance. Some of the inhabitants whose houses were near the temple had fled thither for refuge before the assailants reached them, but in half an hour from the striking of the first blow, these and the troops there were the sole survivors of the population of Camalodunum. For the present the temple was disregarded. It was known that the garrison did not exceed 400, and there was no fear of so small a body assuming the offensive. The work of destruction had commenced. There was but little plundering, for the Britons despised the Roman luxuries, of the greater part of which they did not even comprehend the use. They were Roman, and therefore to be hated as well as despised. Save, therefore, weapons, which were highly prized, and gold ornaments, which were taken as trinkets for the women at home. Nothing was saved. As the defenders of each house were slain, fire was applied to hangings and curtains, and then the assailants hurried away in search of fresh victims. Thus the work of destruction proceeded concurrently with that of massacre, and as the sun rose, vast columns of smoke mounting upward conveyed the news to the women of the Iceni and Trinobantes for a circle of many miles round that the attack had been successful, and that Camalodunum, the seat of their oppressors, was in flames. Beric, as he made his way towards the centre of the town, sighed as he passed the shop where 2 months before he had stopped a moment to look at the rolls of vellum. The destruction of the monuments of Roman luxury, the houses with their costly contents, and even the palace of Cunobeline, which had been converted into the residence of the Roman governor, had not affected him, but he mourned over the loss of the precious manuscripts which had contained such a wealth of stored up learning. Already the house was wrapped in flames, which were rushing from the windows, and the prize which he had looked upon as his own special share of the plunder had escaped him. At the edge of the broad open space that surrounded the temple of Claudius, the Britons were gathering thickly. Beric applied his horn to his lips, and in a few minutes the Sarci gathered round him. Bidding them stand in order, he moved away to see what disposition was being made for the attack on the temple. But at present all were too excited with their success for any to assume the lead or give orders. At the first rush, parties of the Britons had made for the temple, but it had been received with showers of darts and stones, and had been met on the steps by the Roman soldiers and roughly repulsed. Walking round, he came upon the chariots of Boadicea. The queen was flushed with excitement and gratified vengeance, and was shaking her spear menacingly towards the temple. Her eye presently fell upon Beric. "The work has begun well, my young chief, but we have still to crush the wolves in their den. It is a strong place, with its massive walls unpierced save by the doorway at each end, but we will have them out if to do so we are forced to tear it down stone by stone." "I trust that we shall not be as long as that would take, Queen," Beric said, "for we have other work to do." Just at this moment one of the chiefs of the Trinobantes came up. "Queen Boadicea," he said, "we crave that we may be allowed to storm the temple. It is built on our ground as a sign of our subjection, and we would fain ourselves capture it." "Be it so," the queen replied. "Do you understand the task at once?" The Trinobantes, who had joined the Iceni in the attack on the town, presently gathered with loud shouts, and under their chiefs The Trinobantes, who had joined the Iceni in the attack on the town, presently gathered with loud shouts, and under their chiefs rushed at the temple. From the roof darts and stones were showered down upon them, but though many were killed, they swarmed up the broad steps that surrounded it on all sides and attacked the doors. Beric shook his head, and returning to his men led them off down one of the broad streets to an open space a short distance away. "This will be our gathering place," he said. "Do not wander far away, and return quickly at the sound of my horn. We may be wanted presently. I do not think that the Trinobantes will take the temple in that fashion." They had indeed advanced entirely unprovided with proper means of assault. The massive gates against which the Romans had piled stones, casks of provisions, and other heavy articles were not to be broken down by such force as the Britons could bring against them. In vain those chopped with their swords upon the woodwork. The gates were constructed of oak, and the weapons scarce marked them. In vain They threw themselves 20 abreast against them. The door hardly quivered at the shock, and in the meantime the assailants were suffering heavily, for from openings in the roof, extending from the building itself to the pillars that surrounded it, the Romans dropped missiles upon them. For some time the Trinobantes persevered, and then their chief, seeing that the attempt was hopeless, called off their followers. No fresh attempt was made for a time, and Boadicea established herself in one of the few houses that escaped the flames, and there presently the chiefs assembled. Various suggestions were made, but at last it was decided to batter in the doors with a heavy tree, and a strong party of men were at once dispatched to fell and prepare two of suitable size. The operation was a long one, as the trees were found had to be brought down by lighting fires against the trunks, and it was nightfall before they fell and the branches were cut off. It was decided, therefore, to postpone the attack until the next day. Beric had not been present at the council, to which only a few of the leading chiefs had been summoned, but he doubted, when he heard what had been decided upon, whether the attack would be successful. It was settled that the Trinobantes were to attack the door at one end of the temple, and the Iceni that at the other. Late in the evening the chariot returned, and Beric was greatly relieved to hear that the fugitives had been placed in safety, and that the journey had been made without interference. He was glad to recover his torque, for its absence would have excited surprise when men's minds were less occupied and excited. Not until he recovered it could he go see Parta, who was lodged with the queen, but as soon as he recovered it he went in. Every sign of Roman habitation and luxury had been, as far as possible, obliterated by the order of Boadicea before she entered the house. Hangings had been pulled down, statues overthrown, and the paintings on the plaster chipped from the walls. "What have you been doing all day, Beric?" his mother asked. "I looked to see you long before this, and should have thought that some accident had befallen you, had I not known that the news would have been speedily brought to me had it been so." "I have been looking after the tribesmen, mother. I should have come in to see you, but did not wish to intrude among the chiefs in council with the queen. You represented the Sarci here, and had we been wanted you would have sent for me. Who are to attack the temple tomorrow?" "Not the Sarci, my son. Unser begged that he and his tribe might have the honour, and the queen and council granted it to him." "I am glad of it, mother. The duty is an honourable one, but the loss will be heavy, and others can do the work as well as we could, and I want to keep our men from the shock of battle with the legions. Moreover, I doubt whether the doors would be battered down in the way they propose." "You do, Beric, and why is that?" The speaker was Aska, who had just left a group of chiefs gathered round the queen at the other end of the apartment, and had come close without Beric hearing him. The lad coloured. "I spoke only for my mother's hearing, sir," he said. "To no one else should I have ventured to express an opinion on a course agreed upon by those who are older and wiser than myself." "That is right, Beric. The young should be silent in the presence of their elders. Nevertheless, I should like to know why you think the assault is likely to fail." "It was really not my own opinion I was giving, sir. I was thinking of the manner in which the Romans, who are accustomed to besiege places with high walls and strong gates, proceed. They have made these matters a study, while to us an attack upon such a place is altogether new, seeing that none such exist in Britain save those that the Romans have erected." "How would they proceed, Beric?" "They would treat an attack upon such a place as a serious matter, not to be undertaken rashly and hastily, but only after great preparation. In order to batter down a gate or a wall they use heavy beams, such as those that have been prepared for tomorrow, but they affix to the head a shoe of iron or brass. They do not swing it upon men's arms, seeing it would be most difficult to get so many men to exercise their strength together, and indeed could not give it the momentum required. But we propose to have the beam carried by 50 men, and for all to rush forward together and drive it against the door. If the door were weak and would yield to the first blow, that might avail," Beric said. "But unless it does so, the shock will throw down the tree and the men bearing it. Many will be grievously hurt. Moreover, if, as will surely be the case, many of the bearers fall under the darts of the Romans as they approach, others will stumble over their bodies, and the speed of the whole will be greatly checked." "Then can you tell me how the Romans act in such a case, Beric?" "Yes, sir. I have frequently heard relations of sieges from soldiers who have taken part in them. They build, in the first place, movable towers or sheds running on wheels. These towers are made strong enough to resist the stones and missiles the besieged may hurl against them. Under cover of the shelter, men push up the towers to the door or wall to be battered. The beam is then slung on ropes hanging from the inside of the tower. Other ropes are attached. Numbers of men take hold of these, and working together swing the beam backwards and forwards, so that each time it strikes the wall or door a heavy blow. As the beam is of great weight and many men work it, the blows are well nigh irresistible, and the strongest walls crumble and the most massive gates splinter under the shock of its iron head." "The Romans truly are skilled warriors," Aska said. "We are but children in the art of war beside them, and methinks it would be difficult indeed for us to construct such a machine, though mayhap it could be done had we with us many men skilled in the making of chariots. But sometimes, Beric, they must have occasion to attack places where such machines could not well be used. In that case, sir, they sometimes make what they call a tortoise. The soldiers link their broad shields together so as to form a complete covering, resembling the back of a tortoise, and under the shelter of this they advance to the attack. When they reach the foot of the wall, all remain immovable save those in the front line, who labour with iron bars to loosen the stones at the foot of the wall, protected from missiles from above by the shields of their comrades. From time to time they are relieved by fresh workers until the foundations of the wall are deeply undermined. As they proceed, they erect massive props to keep up the wall, and finally fill up the hole with combustibles. After lighting these they retire. When the props are consumed, the wall of course falls, and they then rush forward and climb the breach." "Truly, Beric, you have profited by your lessons," Aska said, laying his hand kindly on the lad's shoulder. "The Druids spoke wisely when they prophesied a great future for you. Before we have done we may have many Roman strongholds to capture, and when we do I will see that the council order that your advice be taken as to how they should be attacked. But in this matter tomorrow things must remain as they are. Unser is a proud chief and headstrong, and would not brook any interference. Should he be repulsed in the assault, I will advise the queen to call up the Sarci and allow you to proceed in your own manner." "I will do my best, sir, but time is needed for proceeding according to the first Roman method, and our shields are too small for the second. The place should be taken by tomorrow night, for Cerealis would assuredly move with his legion to relieve it as soon as he hears the news of our attack." "That is what has been in our minds," Aska said. "Well, what do you say, Beric? After what I saw the other day of the movements you have taught your tribe, I should be sorry to have their ranks thinned in a hopeless attack upon the temple. I would rather that we should leave it for the present and march out to meet Cerealis, leaving a guard here to keep the Romans hemmed in until we have time to deal with them." Beric stood for a minute or two without answering, and then said, "I will undertake it, sir, with the Sarci should Unser's attack fail." Chapter 6: First Successes. Upon leaving his mother, Beric returned to the spot where the Sarci was lying, Some of the chiefs were sitting round a fire made of beams and woodwork dragged from the ruins of the Roman houses. "We must be up an hour before daybreak. I think that there will be work for us tomorrow. If Unser and his tribe fail in capturing the temple, we are to try, and there will be preparations to make." And he explained the plan upon which he had determined. Daylight was just breaking when the Sarci entered the forest 4 miles from Camalodunum. Here they scattered in search of dry wood. In 2 hours sufficient had been gathered for their purpose, and it was made up into 200 great faggots nearly 4 feet across and 10 in length, in weight as much as a strong man can carry on his head. With these they returned to the city. It needed no questions as to the result of the attack, which had just terminated with the same fortune that had befallen that on the day previous. Unser had been killed, and large numbers of his men had fallen in their vain attempt to hew down the gates. The battering rams had proved a complete failure. Many of the 50 men who carried the beam had fallen as they advanced. The others had rushed at the gate door, but the recoil had thrown them down, and many had had their limbs broken from the tree falling on them. Attempts had been made to repeat the assault, but the Romans, having pierced the under part of the roof in many places, let fall javelins and poured down boiling oil, and at last, having done all that was possible, but in vain, the tribesmen had fallen back. Beric proceeded at once to the queen's. A council was being held, and it had just been determined to march away to meet Cerealis when Beric entered. Aska left his place in the circle of chiefs as soon as he saw him enter the door. "Are you ready to undertake it, Beric?" "Do not do so unless you have strong hopes of success. The repulses of yesterday and today have lowered the spirits of our men, and another failure would still further harm us." "I will undertake it, Aska, and I think I can answer for success, but I shall need 3 hours before I begin." "That could be spared," the chief said. "Cerealis will not have learned the news until last night at the earliest. He may not know it yet. There is no fear of his arriving here until tomorrow." Then he returned to his place. "Before we finally decide, Queen," he said, "I would tell you that the young chief Beric is ready to attack the place with the Sarci. He has learned much of the Roman methods, and may be more fortunate than the others have been. I would suggest that he be allowed to try, for it will have a very ill effect upon the tribes if we fail in taking the temple, which is regarded as the symbol of Roman dominion. I will even go so far as to say that a retreat now would go very far to mar our hopes of success in the war, for the news would spread through the country and dispirit others now preparing to join us." "Why should Beric succeed when Unser has failed?" one of the chiefs said. "Can a lad achieve a success where one of our best and bravest chiefs have been repulsed?" "I think that he might," Aska replied. "At any rate, as he is ready to risk his life and his tribe in doing so, I pray the queen to give him consent. He demands 3 hours to make his preparations for the attack." "He shall try," Boadicea said decidedly. "You saw the other day, chiefs, how well he has learned the Roman methods of war. He shall have an opportunity now of turning his knowledge to account. Parta, you are willing that your son should try?" "Certainly I am willing," Parta said. "He can but die once. He cannot die in a nobler effort for his country." "Then it is settled," the queen said. "The Sarci will attack in 3 hours." As soon as Beric heard the decision he hurried away, and at once ordered the tribesmen to scatter through the country, and to kill 200 of the cattle roaming at present masterless, to strip off their hides and bring them in. They returned before the 3 hours expired, bringing in the hides. In the meantime Beric had procured from a half consumed warehouse a quantity of oil, pitch, and other combustibles, and had smeared the faggots with them. On the arrival of the men with the hides, these were bound with the raw side upwards over the faggots. 200 of the strongest men of the tribe were then chosen and divided into 2 parties, and the rest being similarly divided, took their station at the ends of the square facing the gates. When Beric sounded his horn, the faggot bearers raised their burdens onto their heads and formed in a close square, 10 abreast, with the faggots touching each other. Beric himself commanded the party facing the principal entrance, and, holding a blazing torch in each hand, took his place in the centre of the square, there being ample room for him between the lines of men. The rest of the tribe were ordered to stand firmly in order until he gave the signal for the advance. Then he again sounded his horn, and the two parties advanced from the opposite ends of the square. As soon as they came within reach, the Germans showered down darts and javelins, but these either slipped altogether from the surface of the wet hides, or, penetrating them, went but a short distance into the faggots, and the British tribesmen raised shouts of exultation as the two solid bodies advanced unshaken to the steps of the temple. Mounting these, they advanced to the gates. In vain the Romans dropped their javelins perpendicularly through the holes in the ceiling of the colonnade. In vain poured down streams of boiling oil, which had proved so fatal to the last attack. The javelins failed to penetrate. The oil streamed harmless off the hides. The men had, before advancing, received minute instructions. The 10 men in the front line piled their faggots against the door, and then, keeping close to the wall of the temple itself, slipped round to the side colonnade. The operation was repeated by the next line, and so on until but 2 lines remained. Then the 2 men at each end of these lines mounted the pile of faggots and placed their burdens there, leaving but 6 standing in their centre. Beric had his place, and now, kneeling down under their shelter, applied his torches to the pile. He waited till he saw the flames beginning to mount up. Then he gave the word. The 6 men dropped their faggots to the ground, and with him ran swiftly to the side colonnade, where they were in shelter, as the Romans, knowing they could not be attacked here, had made no openings in the ceilings above. The Britons were frantic with delight when they saw columns of smoke, followed by tongues of flame, mounting from either end of the temple. Higher and higher the flames mounted, till they licked the ceiling above them. For half an hour the fire continued. By the end of the time there was but a glowing mass of embers, through which those without could see right into the temple. The doors and the obstacles behind them had been destroyed. As soon as he was aware, by the shouts of his countrymen, that the faggots were well in a blaze, Beric had sounded his horn, and he and the tribesmen from both colonnades had run across the open unmolested by the darts of the Romans, who were too panic stricken at the danger that threatened them to pay any heed to their movements. Beric was received with loud acclamations by the Iceni, and was escorted by a shouting multitude to the queen, who had taken her place at a point where she could watch the operations. She held out her hand to him. "You have succeeded, Beric," she said, "and my thanks and those of all here, nay, of all Britain, are due to you. In half an hour the temple will be open to attack." "Hardly in that time, queen," he replied. "The faggots will doubtless have done their work by then, but it will be hours before the embers and stonework will be sufficiently cool to enable men to pass over them to the assault." "We can wait," the queen said. A messenger who left the camp of Cerealis at daybreak had just arrived, and at that hour nothing was known to the Romans of our attack here. They will not now arrive until tomorrow. Not until the afternoon was it considered that the entrances would be cool enough to pass through. Then the Sarci prepared for the attack, binding pieces of raw hide under their feet to protect them from the heated stonework. They were formed 10 abreast. Beric took his place before the front line of one of the columns, and with levelled spears they advanced at a run towards the doors. A shower of missiles saluted them from the roof. Some fell, but the rest, pressing on in close order, dashed through the gateway and flung themselves upon the Roman soldiers drawn up to oppose their passage. The resistance was feeble. The Romans had entirely lost heart, and could not for a moment sustain the weight of the charge. They were swept away from the entrance, and the Britons poured in. Standing in groups, the Romans defended themselves in desperation, but their efforts were vain, and in 5 minutes the last defender of the place was slain. As soon as the fight was over, the whole of the Iceni rushed tumultuously forward with exultant shouts and filled the temple. Then a horn sounded, and a lane was made as Boadicea, followed by her chiefs and the chieftainess, entered the temple. The queen's face was radiant with triumph, and she would have spoken, but the shouting was so loud that those near her could not obtain silence. They understood, however, when advancing to the statues of the gods that stood behind the altars, she waved a spear. In an instant the tribesmen swarmed round the statues. Ropes were attached to the massive figures, and Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva fell to the ground with a crash, as did the statue of Emperor Claudius. A mighty shout hailed its downfall. The gods of the Britons, insulted and outraged, were avenged upon those of Rome. The altars of Mona had streamed with the blood of the Druids. Those of Camalodunum were wet with the gore of Roman legionaries. The statues were broken to pieces, the altars torn down, and then the chiefs ordered the tribesmen to fetch in faggots. Thousands went to the forest, while others pulled down detached houses and sheds that escaped the flames, and dragged the beams of woodwork to the temple. By nightfall an enormous pile of faggots had raised round each of the 8 interior columns that in the 2 lines supported the roof. Torches were applied by Boadicea, her 2 daughters, and some of the principal Druids, and in a short time the interior of the temple was a glowing furnace. The beams of the ceiling and the roof soon ignited, and the flames shot up high into the air. All day the Trinobantes had been pouring in, and a perfect frenzy of delight reigned among the great crowd looking on as the destruction of the temple that had been raised to signify and celebrate the subjugation of Britain. Women with flowing hair performed wild dances of triumph. Some rushed about as if possessed with madness, uttering prophecies of the total destruction of the Romans. Others foamed at the mouth and fell in convulsions. While the men were scarcely less excited over their success, messengers had already brought in news that at midday Cerealis had learned that Camalodunum had been attacked, and that the legion was to start on the following morning to relieve the town. The news had been taken up to him by one of the Trinobantes, who had received his instructions from Aska. He was to say that the town had suddenly been attacked, and that many had fallen, but the greater portion of the population had escaped to the temple, which had been vainly attacked by the Iceni. The object of this news was to induce Cerealis to move out from his fortified camp. The chiefs felt the difficulty of assaulting such a position, and though they had dreaded the arrival of Cerealis before the temple was taken, they were anxious that he should set out as soon as they saw that Beric's plan of attack had succeeded, and that the temple was now open to their assault. At midnight the roof of the temple fell in, and nothing remained but the bare walls and the columns surrounding them. The chiefs ordered their followers to make their way through the still burning town, and to gather by tribes outside the defensive works, and there lie down until morning, when they would march to meet the legion of Cerealis. At daybreak they were again afoot and on the march southward, swollen by the accession of the Trinobantes, and by the arrival during the last 2 days of tribes who had been too late to join the rest at Cardum. The British force now numbered at least 50,000. "It is a great army, Beric," Boduoc said exultingly as they moved forward. "It is a great host," Beric replied. "I would that it were an army. Had they all even as much training as our men, I should feel confident in the future. But surely you are confident now, Beric. We have begun well." "We have scarcely begun at all," Beric said. "What have we done? Destroyed a sleeping town, and captured by means of a fire a temple defended by 400 men. We shall win today, that I do not doubt. The men are wrought up by the success, and the Romans are little prepared to meet such a force. I doubt not that we shall beat them, but to crush a legion is not to defeat Rome. I hope, Boduoc. I do not feel confident. Look back at the Sarci, and then look round at this disordered host. Well, the Romans in discipline and order exceeded the Sarci as much as we exceeded the rest of the Iceni. They will be led by generals trained in war. We are led by chiefs whose only idea of war is to place themselves at the head of their tribe and rush against the enemy. Whether courage and great numbers can compensate for want of discipline remains to be seen. The history of Rome tells me that it has never done so yet." After 5 hours' marching, some fleet-footed scouts sent on ahead brought in news that the Romans were approaching. A halt was called, and the chiefs assembled round the queen's chariot in council. Beric was summoned by a messenger from the queen. "You must always attend our council," she said when he came up. "You have proved that, young as you are, you possess a knowledge of war that more than compensates for your lack of years. You have the right, after capturing the temple for us, to take for the Sarci the post of honour in today's battle. Choose it for yourself. You know the Romans. Where do you think we had better fight them?" "I think we could not do better than await them here," he said. "We stand on rising ground, and one of the Trinobantes to whom I have just spoken says that there is a swamp away on the left of our front, so that the Roman horsemen cannot advance in that direction. I should attack them in face and on their left flank, closing in thickly so as to prevent their horsemen from breaking out to the plain at our right and then falling upon us in our rear. Since you are good enough to say that I may choose my post for the Sarci, I will hold them where they stand. Then, should the others fail to break the Roman front, we will move down upon them and check their advance while the rest attack their flanks." This answer pleased some of the chiefs, who felt jealous of the honour the small tribe had gained on the previous day. They were afraid that Beric would have chosen to head the attack. "Does that plan please you?" Boadicea asked. "It is as well as another," one of the chiefs said. "Let the Sarci look on this time while we destroy the enemy. I should have thought Beric would have chosen for his tribe the post of honour in the attack." "The Romans always keep their best troops in reserve," Beric said quietly. "In a hard fight it is the reserve that decides the fate of the battle." "Then let it be so," Boadicea said. "Is the swamp that you speak of deep?" "It is not too deep for our men to cross," one of the chiefs of the Trinobantes said, "but assuredly a horseman could not pass through it." "Very well, then, let the Trinobantes attack by falling upon the Romans on our right. The Iceni will attack them in the front, and the Sarci will remain where they stand until Beric sees need for them to advance." In a few minutes the Roman legion was seen advancing with a portion of the cavalry in front and the rest in the rear. The queen, whose chariot was placed in front of the line, raised her spear. A tremendous shout was raised by the Britons, and with wild cries the tribes poured down to the attack, while the women clustered on the slopes they had left, added their shrill cries of encouragement to the din. The Romans, who, believing that the Britons were still engaged in the attack on Camalodunum, had no expectation of meeting them on the march, halted and stood uncertain as the masses of Britons poured down to the attack. Then their trumpets sounded and they again advanced, the cavalry in the rear moving forward to join those in the advance. But before they accomplished this the Britons were upon them. Showers of darts were poured in, and the horsemen, unable to stand the onslaught, rode into the spaces between the companies of the infantry, who, moving outwards and forming a solid column on either flank, protected them from the assault of their foes. The Britons, after pouring in showers of javelins, flung themselves sword in hand upon the Roman infantry, but these with levelled spears showed so solid a front that they were unable to break through, while from behind the spearmen the light armed Roman troops poured volleys of missiles among them. Boadicea called Beric to her side. "It is as you said, Beric. The order in which the Romans fight is wonderful. See how steady they hold together. It is like a wild boar attacked by dogs, but they will be overwhelmed. See how the darts fly, and how bravely the Iceni are fighting." The tribesmen indeed were attacking with desperate bravery. Seizing the heads of the spears, they attempted to wrest them from the holders, or to thrust them aside and push forward within striking distance. Sometimes they partially succeeded, and though the first might fall, others rushing in behind reached the Romans and pressed them backwards. But reserves were brought up and the line restored. Then slowly but steadily the Romans moved forward, and although partial success had at some point attended those who attacked them in flank, the front of the column with serried spears held its way on in spite of the efforts of the Britons to arrest the movement. Presently the supply of javelins of their assailants began to fail, and the assault upon the head of the column to grow more feeble, while the shouts of the Roman soldiers rose above the cries of their assailants. "Now is the time for us to move down," Beric said. "If we can arrest the advance, their flanks will be broken in before long. Now, men," he shouted as he returned to his place at the head of the Sarci, "now is the time to show that you can meet the Romans in their own fashion. Move slowly down to the attack. Let no man hasten his pace, but let each keep his place in the rank. 4 companies will attack the Romans in front. The others, in column 5 deep, will march down till they face the Roman flank. Then they will march at it, spears down, and break it in." Beric sounded his bugle, and 10 deep the 400 men moved steadily down to the attack of the Romans. The 5 front ranks marched with levelled spears. Those behind prepared to hurl their darts over their heads. When within 50 yards of the enemy, the Sarci raised their battle cry, and the Iceni engaged with the Romans in front, seeing the hedge of spears advancing behind them, hurriedly ran off at both flanks, and the Sarci advanced to the attack. The Romans halted involuntarily, astonished at the spectacle. Never before had they encountered barbarians advancing in formation similar to their own, and the sight of the tall figures advancing almost naked to the assault, for the Britons always threw off their garments before fighting, filled them with something like consternation. At the shouts of their officers, however, they again got into motion and met the Britons firmly. The additional length Beric had given to the spears of the Sarci now proved of vital advantage, and bearing steadily onward they brought the Romans to a standstill, while the javelins from the British ranks fell thickly and fast among them. Gradually the Romans were pressed backwards, quickly as the gaps were filled up by those behind, till the charging shout of the Sarci on their flanks was heard. Beric blew his horn, and his men, with an answering shout, pressed forward faster, their cries of victory rising as the Romans gave way. Still the latter fought stubbornly, until triumph yells and confused shouts told them that the flank had given way under the attack of the Britons. Then Beric's horn sounded again. The slow advance was converted into a charge. The ranks behind closed up, and before the weight and impetus of the rush the Roman line was broken. Then the impetuosity of the Sarci could no longer be restrained. In vain Beric blew his horn. Flinging down their spears and drawing their swords, the Britons flung themselves on the broken mass, the other tribesmen pouring in tumultuously behind them. For a few minutes a desperate conflict raged, each man fighting for himself, but numbers prevailed. The Roman shouts became feebler, the war cries of the Britons louder and more triumphant. In 10 minutes the fight was over. More than 2,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, while Cerealis and the cavalry, bursting their way through their assailants, alone escaped, galloping off at full speed towards the refuge of their fortified camp. The exultation of the Britons knew no bounds. They had, for the first time since the Romans set foot on their shore, beaten them in a fair fight in the open. There was a rush to collect arms, shields, and helmets of the fallen Romans, and 2 of the Sarci presently brought the standards of the legion to Beric. "Follow me with them," he said, and extricating himself from the throng, ascended the slope to where Boadicea, surrounded with women who were dancing and joining in a triumphal chant of victory, was still standing in her chariot. "Here are the Roman standards, the emblems of victory," Beric said as he approached the chariot. Boadicea sprang down, and advancing to him embraced him warmly. "The victory is yours, Beric," she said. "Keep these 2 eagles and fix them on your hall, so that your children's children may point to them with pride and say, 'It was Beric, chief of the Sarci, who first overthrew the Romans in the field.' But there is no time to be lost," and she turned to her charioteer, who carried a horn. "Sound the summons for the chiefs to assemble." There were several missing, for the Britons had suffered heavily in their first attack. "Chiefs," she said, "let us not lose an instant, but press on after the Romans. Let us strike before they recover from their confusion and surprise. Catus Decianus may be in their camp, and while I seek no other spoil, him I must have to wreak my vengeance on. See that a party remain to look to the wounded, and that such as need it are taken to their homes in wagons." The horns were at once sounded. The tribesmen flocked back to the positions from which they had charged, and resumed their garments. Then the march was continued. They presented a strange appearance now. Almost every man had taken possession of some portion or other of the Romans' arms. Some had helmets, others shields, others breastplates, swords, or spears. The helmets, however, were speedily taken off and slung behind them, the heads of the Iceni being vastly larger than those of the Romans, the tallest of whom they overtopped by a full 6 inches. The arms of the officer who commanded under Cerealis was offered to Beric, but he refused them. "I fight to drive the Romans from our land," he said, "and not for spoil. Nothing of theirs will I touch, but will return to the forest when all is over, just as I left it." By evening they approached the Roman camp. A portion of the legion had been left there when Cerealis set out, and in the light of the setting sun the helmets and spearheads could be seen above the massive palisades that rose on the top of the outworks. The Britons halted half a mile away. The fires were lighted, and the men sat down to feast upon the meat that had been brought in wagons from Camalodunum. Then a council was held. As a rule, the British councils were attended by all able-bodied men. The power of the chiefs, except in actual war, was very small, for the Britons, like their Gaulish ancestors, considered every man to be equal, and each had a voice in the management of affairs. Thus every chief had, before taking up arms, held a council of his tribesmen, and it was only after they had given their vote for war that he possessed any distinct power and control. When the council began, one of the chiefs of the Trinobantes was asked first to give a minute description of the Roman camp. The works were formidable. Surrounding it was a broad and deep fosse, into which a stream was turned. Beyond this there was a double vallum of wall of earth, so steep as to be climbed with great difficulty. In the hollow between the 2 walls sharp stakes were set thickly together. The second wall was higher than the first, and completely commanded it. Along its top ran a solid palisade of massive beams, behind which the earth was banked up to within some 3½ feet from the top, affording a stand for archers, slingers, and spearmen. The council was animated, but the great majority of chiefs were in favour of leaving this formidable position untouched and falling upon places that offered a chance of easier capture. The British in their tribal wars fought largely for the sake of plunder. In their first burst of fury at Camalodunum they had, contrary to their custom, sought only to destroy, but their thirst for blood was now appeased. They longed for the rich spoils of the Roman cities, both as trophies of victory and to adorn their women. The chiefs represented that already many of their bravest tribesmen had fallen, and it would be folly to risk a heavy loss in the attack upon such a position. No matter, they argued, if 200 or 300 Romans were left there for the present. They could do no harm, and could be either captured by force or obliged to surrender by hunger after Suetonius and the Roman army had been destroyed. Not a day should be lost, they contended, in marching upon Verulamium, after which London could be sacked. For although far inferior in size and importance to Camalodunum and Verulamium, it was a rising town, inhabited by a large number of merchants and traders who imported goods from Gaul and distributed them over the country. Beric's opinion was in favour of an instant assault, and in this he was supported by Asker and 2 or 3 of the older chiefs, but the majority were the other way, and the policy of leaving altogether the fortified posts garrisoned by the Romans to be dealt with after the Roman army has been met and destroyed was decided upon. One of the arguments employed was that while the capture of these places would be attended with considerable loss, it would add little to the effect that the news of the destruction of the chief Roman towns would have upon the tribes throughout the whole country, and would take so long that Suetonius might return in time to succour the most important places before the work was done. Aska walked away from the council with Beric. "They have decided wrongly," he said. "I do not think it much matters," Beric replied. "Everything hangs at present upon the result of our battle with Suetonius. If we win, all the detached forts may surrender. If we lose, what matters it?" "You think we shall lose, Beric?" "I do not say that," Beric said, "but see how it was today. The Iceni made no more impression upon the Roman column than if they had been attacking a wall. They hindered themselves by their very numbers, and by the time we meet the Romans our numbers will be multiplied by 5, perhaps by 10. But shall we be any stronger thereby? Will not rather the confusion be greater? Today the Roman horse fled, but had they charged among us, small as was their number, what confusion would they have made in our ranks? A single Briton is a match for a single Roman and more. 10 Romans fighting in order might repel the assault of 100, and as the numbers multiply, so does the advantage of discipline increase. I hope for victory, Aska, but I cannot say that I feel confident of it." Marching next morning against Verulamium, they arrived there in the afternoon and at once attacked it. The resistance was feeble, and bursting through in several places, the Iceni and the Trinobantes spread over the town, slaughtering all they found. Not only the Romans but the Gauls settled in the city, and such Britons as had adopted Roman customs were put to the sword. The city was then sacked and set on fire. It was now decided that instead of turning towards London they should march west, in order that they might be joined by other tribes on their way and meet Suetonius returning from Wales. There was no haste in their movement. They advanced by easy stages, their numbers swelling every day, tribe after tribe joining them as the news spread of the capture and destruction of the 2 chief Roman towns, and the defeat and annihilation of one of the legions. So they marched until, a fortnight after the capture of Verulamium, the news arrived that Suetonius, marching with all speed towards the east, had already passed them. gathering up on his way the garrisons of all the fortified posts. Then the great host turned and marched east again. Beric regretted deeply the course that had been taken. Had the garrisons all been attacked and destroyed separately, the army they would have to encounter would have been a little more than half the strength of that which Suetonius would be able to put into the field when he collected all the garrisons. But the Britons troubled themselves in no way. They regarded victory as certain, and expressed exultation that they should crush all the Romans at one blow in the open field, instead of being forced to undertake a number of separate sieges. Still marching easily, they came down upon the valley of the Thames and followed it until they arrived at London. They had expected that Suetonius would give battle before they arrived there. He had indeed passed through the town a few days previously, but had disregarded the prayers of the inhabitants to remain for their protection. He allowed all males who chose to do so to enlist in the ranks and permitted others to accompany the army, but he wished before fighting to be joined by Cerealis and the survivors of his legion, and by the garrisons of other fortified posts. The Britons therefore fell upon London, slaughtered all the inhabitants, and sacked and burned the town. It was calculated that here and in the two Roman cities no less than 80,000 persons had been slain. This accomplished, the great host again set out in search of Suetonius. They were accompanied now by a vast train of wagons and chariots carrying the women and spoil. Beric was not present at the sack of London. As they approached the town, and it became known that Suetonius had marched away and that there would be no resistance, he struck off north. Since they had left Verulamium, the tribesmen had given up marching in military order. They were very proud of the credit they had gained in the battle with the Romans, but said that they did not see any use in marching tediously abreast when there was no enemy near. Beric, having no power whatever to compel them, told them that of course they could do as they liked, but that they would speedily forget all that they had learned. But the impatience of restraint of any kind, or of doing anything unless perfectly disposed to do it, which was a British characteristic, was too strong, and many were influenced by the scoffs of the newcomers, who, not having seen them in the day of the battle, asked them scornfully if the Sarci were slaves that they should obey orders like Roman soldiers. Boduoc, although he had objected to the drill at first, and had scoffed at the idea of men fighting any better because they all kept an even distance from each other and marched with the same foot forward, had now become an enthusiast in its favour, and raged at this falling away. But Beric said, "It is no use being angry, Boduoc. I was surprised that they consented at first, and I am not surprised that they have grown tired of it. It is the fault of our people to be fickle and inconstant, soon wearying of anything they undertake. But I do not think that it matters much now. We alone were able to decide the fight when there were but 2,000 Roman spearmen. But when we meet Suetonius, he will have 10,000 soldiers under him, and our multitude is so great that the Sarci would be lost in the crowd. If the Britons cannot beat them without us, we should not suffice to change the fortunes of the day." It was partly to escape the sight of the sack of London, partly because he was anxious to know how Berenice and Cneius Nepo were faring, that Beric left the army and drove north in a chariot. After 2 days' journey he arrived at the cottage of Boduoc's mother. The door stood open, as was the universal custom in Britain, for nowhere was hospitality so lavishly practised, and it was thought that a closed door might deter a passerby from entering. His footsteps had been heard, for 2 dogs had growled angrily at his approach. The old woman was sitting at the fire, and at first he saw no one else in the hut. Good will to all here, he said. It is the young chief, the old woman exclaimed, and at once two figures rose from a pile of straw in a dark corner of the room. Beric. Yes, it is I, he said. How fares it with you, Berenice? You are well, Cneius, I hope? You have run no risk, I trust, since you have been here. We are well, Beric, the girl said, but oh, the time has seemed so long. It is not yet a month since you sent us here, but it seems a year. She has been very kind to us and done all they could, and the girls, her daughters, have gone with me sometimes for rambles in the wood, but they cannot speak our language. Not another person has been here since we came. What is the news, Beric? Cneius asked. No word has reached us. The old woman and her daughters have learned something, for the eldest girl goes away sometimes for hours, and I can see that she tells her mother news when she returns. Beric briefly told them what had happened, at which Berenice exclaimed passionately that the Britons were a wicked people. Then there will be a great battle when you meet Suetonius, Beric, Cneius said. How think you will it go? It's hard to say, Beric replied. We are more than 150,000 men against 10,000, but the 10,000 are soldiers, while the 150,000 are a mob. Brave and devoted and fearless of death, I admit. I cannot say how it will go. How long shall we stay here, Beric? Berenice asked. When will you take me to my father? If we are beaten, Berenice, you will rejoin him speedily. If we win, he will not be alive, she broke in. Beric did not contradict her, but went on. I will see that you are placed on board a ship and sent to Gaul. It is for this I come here today, Cneius. In 2 or 3 days we shall meet Suetonius. If we win, I will return to you myself. Or if I am killed, Boduoc or his brother, both of whom I shall charge with the mission, will come in my place and will escort you to the coast and see that you are placed on board ship. If we lose, it is likely that none of us will return. I shall give the old women instructions that in that case a daughter is to guide you through the forest and take you on until you meet some Roman soldiers, or are within sight of their camp. Then you will only have to advance and declare yourself. Then she turned and spoke for some time to Boduoc's mother in her own language, thanking her for the shelter that she had given the fugitives, and giving instructions as to the future. He took a hasty meal and started at once on his return journey. In order to rejoin the Sarci as the army advanced from London, Berenice wept bitterly when he said goodbye, and Cneius himself was much affected. I view you almost as a son, he said, and it is terrible to know that if you win in the battle, my patron Caius and my countrymen will be destroyed, while if they win, you may fall. It is the fortune of war, Cneius. You know that we Britons look forward to death with joy, that unlike you, we mourn at a birth and feast at a burial, knowing that after death we go to the happy island where there is no more trouble or sorrow, but where all is peace and happiness and content. So do not grieve for me. You will know that if I fail I shall be happy and shall be free from all the troubles that await this unfortunate land.